sound level. Is there anybody that can't hear? Can't hear me? Okay. Welcome again to St Giles, and I say again because there are some wonderfully familiar faces. Once again, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker, and today we have Father Brendan Thomas, who was clothed as a monk 25 years ago yesterday. So that is a fantastic thing. Congratulations. He's going to give a presentation with his PowerPoint, and he's going to talk as well, and there'll be a few minutes of questions possibly at the end. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, it's very nice to be with you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
And you can see the screen, more or less, we're okay. Thank you, good. Well, let me begin. The title that I have is Benedict, Human and Holy. And I'm Novice Master in my monastery. I thought I would show you a photograph of the monastery to begin before getting into Benedict. I also run a training course for monks and nuns from all over the world in Rome, a 3-month course every year. So two different particular strands to my work. Benedict, Human and Holy. What I thought I would do is really, I think St. Benedict is a wonderful, amazing figure. And over 25 years, the more I've watched, most days I have classes with the novices, studying the rule, the tradition, etc. And the more you get to know St. Benedict, the more lovable he is. And what I thought I would do is just simply take his life, but to talk about his human and spiritual growth through his life, really, and to talk about what he became, in effect, at the end of his life. So that's the basic plan. And I thought I'd illustrate it, just to orientate you a tiny bit. He was born in Norcia, in the north of Italy, not too far from Assisi, and travelled down to Rome. He began his monastic life at Subiaco, out east of Rome, and then ended his life at Monte Cassino. And those are the principal places, and I'll talk about one or two other places as we go along as well. But Norcia, his birthplace, even though there's not much to say about this in one sense, he was a twin, of course, according to the dialogues. We could have a debate about the dialogues and etc., etc. But simply put, he was a twin, his sister Scholastica, born in Norcia, or at least the province of Norcia. And it's a beautiful little town. The Benedictines and Cistercians often use the phrase lovers of place. Monasteries, belong to an environment, are shaped by the environment. Antony the Great of Egypt, it said of him, he loved this place. And I do think, and that's why I'm really looking at the places of Benedict along the way, because in some sense I think they shaped Benedict's spiritual life. And when I think of Norcia, the former Abbot Primate, Victor Damas, used the image of Norcia being Benedict's Bethlehem, Subiaco his Nazareth, and Monte Cassino his Jerusalem. A nice little image, really. And in a sense, Norcia is Benedict's awakening, I think, to his spiritual journey. It's a lovely little town, walled town, surrounded by mountains. I lift up my eyes to the mountains, and where shall come my help? We know that hermits lived in the hills around Norcia. And certainly, his spiritual beginnings began there, his awakening, really. Up above are the most splendid mountains. There's the square where the basilica, where traditionally marks the place of his birthplace, but that's very much tradition rather than fact. I went there just a few months ago with some monks and nuns, and you can't help, the hills are alive with the sound of music on the mountains, because it's just the most exceptional scenery above the mountains, and you see they're grouped from all over the world with us. That's a monk of Abbey, the confrere of Father Michael over there. So anyway, I just wanted to show you those mountains. He headed off to Rome for his studies, off to the city, off for studies, and entered into his studies. And these are frescoes from Monte Oliveto by Signorelli or Sodoma, Italian artists. A whole series of wonderful frescoes. Of course, things didn't go well in Rome. He found it a despicable place, corrupt place, horrible place. So then his monastic journey began in earnest, really, when he headed out from Rome to Subiaco to the west. Subiaco, Benedict's Nazareth. Subiaco is famous for three things. In that little castle there was born Lucretia Borgia. We don't want to talk about her. Just below the castle was born Gina Lollobrigida. We don't want to talk about her either. But just out into the hills, Benedict went and began his monastic life. And there's the Sacro Speckle, the holy cave. It's a little monastery built around the cave of Benedict, and it's a beautiful place to visit today. He finds the cave. There he is clothed in the monastic habit, the traditional beginning of the monastic life, the clothing. Oops. And then the famous scene of him being fed by a basket, I suppose, with some good pasta asciutta, some pasta, and the devil trying to break the rope so he wouldn't get fed. They're lovely stories. And the source of his life are the dialogues of Gregory the Great. Obviously, if one's looking in academic terms, then it's hagiography, one has to read them with care. But that's a long story and not to go into. Really, the Benedict I know comes through the rule. But the life of St. Gregory the Great provides a sort of backdrop, really, to it. And I suppose, just to begin with spiritual things, really, spiritual awakening at Norcia. But just the image of the narrow valley, it's a very narrow valley. I'm from South Wales, from the South Wales Valley, so I'm used to narrow valleys. Narrow valley and the dark cave. And the image of these places stays with me in a strong way, because it is a very narrow valley. And at the entrance to, as you go into the Sacro Speckle today, there's a medieval, let's say in the rule itself, St. Benedict says, it's love that impels them to pursue everlasting life. Therefore they are eager to take the narrow road, which the Lord says, narrow is the road that leads to life. Obviously, the part of the spiritual journey of Benedict described in the rule involves a degree of asceticism. It's not a very popular word today, asceticism. But it involves a certain saying no, which I think is a necessary part of life, really. A no to ego, a no to the self, in order to learn to be open towards others. We have to say no, sometimes to good things, in order to be open to better things. And I think this is part of the path that some of the rule could seem a little harsh, perhaps. But he says, I don't want to lay down anything harsh or burdensome. But a little narrowness, a little strictness is necessary. He says that in the prologue. Do not take fright straight off and run away from the path that leads to salvation. Its beginning cannot be but straight and narrow. We are all on a spiritual journey of some sorts. We are all seeking God. And, the day that we say we've found him, I think it's the day we make a mistake. We're always searching, always looking, and always need to be open. We're always on the path. And sometimes we need to focus in on it. A little strictness, a little narrowness is necessary. So the narrow valley I think represents something that Benedict says how the monastic life needs to be. When novices come to the monastery, the life at the beginning is a little bit more rigid, a little bit more narrow in a sense, and one needs that framework really, in some way to internalize that, in order to find that inner freedom to live, I think. The dark cave. At the entrance to the doorway of Subiaco is a little tablet that's medieval, that's centuries old. And it's rather strange, and I thought I would read it out because it asks a question. If you are seeking the light, Benedict, why do you choose a dark grotto? The grotto does not offer the light you are seeking. But continue in the darkness to seek the shining light, because only on a dark night do the stars shine. Now, Benedict isn't the sort of writer. He's not a John of the Cross. He's not going to be talking about the dark night of the soul. And yet, he talks about real human life, and we all know that real human life entails a degree of darkness, of difficulty, of struggle. And I think we could probably agree, if we had a conversation of time to chat, we'd agree that the struggles are often the times of growth. And in a community in particular, sometimes people imagine that a community is like a sort of, like a little desert oasis under a palm tree and everything's peaceful and serene. And people arrive at the monastery and say, oh, it's so peaceful here. And I want to say, wait till you meet the brethren. It's real life. We're all trying to grow in real life. And read the role of Benedict, as many of you perhaps have done, and know it well. It's real life that he describes. And I'm sure that a darkness is part of that real life. And as we go on through his story a little bit, there are episodes that we might think are pretty dark. And although, as I say, he doesn't describe dark night of the soul, etc., he knew struggles. Let me just go through some episodes really that talks about that really. But just in modern terms, some of you may remember when Mother Teresa of Calcutta's letters were published, and it was realized that this woman, so full of love, so full of energy, so full of goodness, actually within herself had a dryness, the darkness, a barrenness in her spiritual life. And yet she said she came to love the darkness. I have come to love the darkness, for I believe now that it's part of a very, very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. We have to learn to integrate the darkness. We have to learn to move beyond the struggles, to look towards the cross. And if you go in the dark cave, it actually, as you go into Subiaco, what you find is beautiful scenes of the Passion by a Sienese artist on the walls all around. Wonderful, colourful scenes of the Passion. But you go down to the cave of Benedict. Just come to that in a second. For Benedict, the path is of humility and patience. Humility and, what's that in practical terms, I'd say for Benedict is patience. It's probably what a lot of us pray for, a bit more patience with each other. You certainly pray in community. Because the people you live with aren't hand-picked, chosen people. They are people like any community, parish community, whatever. Let me go through this quickly. That it's a path of being humbled. We should be humbled. Whoever humbles himself should be exalted. Just like, move on quickly, sorry, Jacob's ladder, and that's the image of chapter 7, the ladder of humility. A sort of Alice in Wonderland, topsy-turvy ladder where you go up by going down, which is the way of Christ. It's not a way of looking up to the clouds, glorious contemplation. It's being engaged with the earth. Humility, humus, the earth. being rooted in the earth, being down to earth. That's what humility is about. Truthful living is a phrase that one Michael Casey uses. Truthful living. And that's what it is. The fourth, this is the most difficult step perhaps for a monk, and for anybody, the fourth step of humility is that in this obedience, under difficult, unfavourable, or even unjust conditions, his heart quietly embraces suffering and endures it without weakening or seeking escape. We can all think of moments when we've been wronged, and we like to get our own back. That's the natural instinct. But sometimes we come to realise that the better path is actually the way of patience, the way of humility. It's better to bite our tongue, even if it's difficult. So the spiritual struggle is, the spiritual path is a real struggle, I would say. In the cave at Subiaco, this is the statue of St. Benedict there in the cave, and looking towards the cross is by a disciple of Bernini. And it's interesting, I think, that Benedict gazes towards the cross. The path of Christ's path has to go by the way of the cross. Has to go by the way of the cross. And opposite that statue is a little mosaic, and the words in the mosaic say, "We shall through patience share in the sufferings of Christ, that we may share in his resurrection." Patience, it's obedience lived. How is it lived in our daily lives? Quite often patience with each other. They should learn to they should each try to be the first to show respect to each other, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body or behaviour. After the cave, he really began his monastic life. His first community, and I think this is actually, again, quite significant. This is a picture of some Roman ruins. Now, you've probably seen enough pictures of Roman bricks which don't say very much at all. And in one sense, they don't, except to know that at Subiaco, the Emperor Nero built an artificial lake. In fact, the name Subiaco, Sublacensis, below or alongside the lake, the lago, Sublacensis. Nero built a palace there, as Romans do to this day. When it gets very hot in the summer, they go out to the hills. They go out to the Colle Albani, the lovely little towns, the Castelli Romani, around Rome. They go out as far as Subiaco. And alongside this artificial lake that Nero built are remains of his summer residence, a modest place, I think, nothing like Nero's Golden Palace near the Colosseum. But there is archaeological evidence that it was inhabited at Benedict's time, so there's a bit of archaeology behind this indication in St. Gregory's life. It's sometimes called the Proto-Cenobium of Benedict, his first monastery, dedicated, according to the local sources, to San Clemente, St. Clement, or the Blessed Virgin Mary, two different sources. It's worth thinking of what type of monks were in Benedict's community. If one reads the dialogues of Gregory the Great, which, as I said, as a reliable source, perhaps is not as dependable of this as the rule itself. But there are the nobles, the rich, the highly educated, the poor, the destitute, illiterate soldiers, government officials, craftsmen, Romans, Goths, priests, visiting monks, conversi, who are reformed sinners, former slaves and free men, the old and the young. Quite a mix. Just think one of those categories, the conversi. In these times, which are a lot more violent, I've just been reading a life of Caravaggio, and there's violence on every page of the artist himself. Murder, mayhem, etc., etc. That's much later. But in these times, if you murdered somebody, what would the priest say to you in confession? He might say, well, go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as a real penance. Today it might be an Our Father or Hail Mary or something. Not for murder, probably. Might be go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Or they might say, go and join a monastery. Well, that's a real... Not so nice for the monks in the monastery, with murderers coming arriving on the doorstep to join. You know, to have a few murderers in the community is not something I would like. But one can imagine the mix. Benedict's time was the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. There was a lot of movements of people, a lot of people abroad, exiled, moving around, the word's gone, but anyway, people, displaced persons, you know, that sort of thing. Not easy times. And it's once Benedict's task and the Benedictine centuries were to try to restore some of that stability that had fallen apart. From the rule itself, we read of the strong and the weak, the undisciplined, the restless, the obedient, the gentle, the patient, the negligent. When a monk comes to take his vows, if you can't sign your name, just write a cross. Okay, so there were different levels in the community. Quite a mixed community. Now, Benedict founded 12 monasteries in this valley around Subiaco. And there's one place that he was called Vicovaro, crisis, thorns of contention. It's a place not too far from Subiaco. There's a Franciscan monastery there today. But you can actually visit some hermit's caves. It's not a very good photograph, but it's on the edge of a cliff. If you stand back, you go down the cliff. But you can see a little bit of one of the hermit's caves there. And inside one of the caves is this fresco of St. Benedict holding up a goblet. And the monks gave him poisoned wine. They wanted to kill him. But as he held up the goblet, so Gregory the Great story goes, it shattered. There, it's breaking. You can see in that detail. There's another story of a jealous priest who came to poison him with bread. Sometimes if you see images of St. Benedict, you might see him with a raven at his foot, or with a broken chalice, sometimes with a snake coming out, which illustrates the poison. In his list of the tools of good work, St. Benedict says, you are not to kill. You might think you don't need to say that to monks, you shouldn't need to, but given the times of Benedict, perhaps it was necessary, and I don't think he was the last monk. They were the last monks to try to kill their abbots. The history of monasticism is full of colourful stories, and love your enemies. If people curse you, do not curse them, but bless them back, but curse them back, but bless them instead. Endure persecution for the sake of justice. And again, he says in the celebration of Lauds every morning, the celebration of Lauds and Vespers was never passed by without the superior reciting the entire Lord's Prayer at the end for all to hear, because thorns of contention are likely to spring up. Thus warned by the pledge they make to one another in the very words of this prayer, forgive us as we forgive, they may cleanse themselves of this kind of vice. One of the greatest evils in the monastery of St. Benedict is murmuring. And I suppose, you know, a modern equivalent of this murmuring or gossiping, you know. How easy it is to run each other down. And the Desert Father, to go back in terms of monastic spirituality, they talk about, and Benedict does as well, the importance of thoughts, of what's going on in our heads. How often we rerun the tape of past hurts, of bruises, and it stirs things up in us. That happens within us, but this also happens within a community. How we stir things up. And if we're not careful, that negative air can pervade a monastic community, a parish community, any community. We have to be careful with our thoughts. We have to be careful with our words. So, I mean, this is a sort of summary of Benedict's spirituality in a sense. Some of the others may have talked about this along the way. So there's a chalice broken. This is stained glass in our monastery, in fact. And the snake coming out in broken chalice. Also another stained glass. A motto of our congregation, the English Benedictine congregation, is Pax, is peace in a crown of thorns. Pax inter spinas. Peace in a crown of thorns. You know, peace doesn't just descend suddenly. It comes out of real life. We have to work at peace. We have to be peacemakers, builders of peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. Benedict says, let peace be your quest and your aim. Never give a hollow greeting of peace. It's something we have to constantly work at in our communities. So he went through these difficulties. The life describes not an easy life. But let's move on. Because at some point, we don't know when, he moved to Monte Cassino, and traditionally it's the place where he is said to have written his rule. Benedict's Jerusalem, if you like. You are a light of the world, a city built on a hilltop, cannot be hidden. And again, the geography of the place, you know, we'd been in the valley looking up to the mountains, his soul awakened at Norcia. We'd gone into the narrow valley, the narrowness of the monastic life, and the narrowness of what perhaps Lent calls us to. And Benedict says the monastic life should be a constant Lent, a constant narrowness, a focusing. But then a climbing towards Jerusalem. And Monte Cassino is a wonderful, very, very different place. Monastery built on a big mountaintop. It takes about, 20 minutes to go to zigzag up on a car or a coach. And there it is today. I just briefly, that's the cloister, romantic cloister it's called. Just the motto of Monte Cassino is Suscissa virescet, cut down, it grows green, which is the Paschal mystery in a sense. You know, it's the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection lived out in this community, and it's really being lived out in this community in a particular way because that monastery has been destroyed again and again and again. Benedict foresaw it in his own lifetime according to the dialogues of St. Gregory, and that's one of the frescoes there in the monastery. It was destroyed by the Lombards in 585, the Saracens in 884, the Normans in 1046, an earthquake in 1349, and then Allied bombings in 1944. So it's had a very difficult history, and that's a fresco there showing the monks coming out after the Allied bombings, because the monks actually were in the monastery, in a cellar, some of them, a group of them, with the abbot during that bombing. And I thought I'd just show you quickly, although it's not entirely relevant, just one or two pictures. 453 tons of bombs were dropped on the Abbey of Monte Cassino, and there you can see an image of it destroyed, really. And another one. It was built on the site of a Roman temple, and you can see Roman remains there. It's very interesting. And this is, I just want to show you this, because it's so lovely. Benedict, amongst, everything destroyed, the walls, the statue of Benedict, apart from his head, remained standing. And that's, if you go there today, you see the statue with his head restored, but it's incredible the way, at least the statue itself, apart from his head, remained there in the midst of all that destruction. Even the raven at his feet there. Now, let's bring this together in a sense. And I'd like to talk about, because the title is Benedict, Human and Holy. And I tried to describe his real life, really, as described in the sources, the more hagiographic, the great dialogues, but the rule itself, which in its lines tells us so much about Benedict and his own personal disposition, I suppose. One of the great commentators on the rule was a French monk who died, I think last year or this year, called Abbey de Vogüé. And he said the rule of St. Benedict begins in the desert of Egypt and ends in the city of Augustine. And I think there he summarises a great deal, really. Because what Benedict does, Benedict, when he wrote his rule, wasn't really doing anything particularly new. He didn't see himself, I think, as... He's not the founder of monasticism. Others had written rules before him. Benedict is the great humane synthesizer. A person who could bring together the traditions in a way, the great spiritual traditions, while keeping in focus the human community in front of him. He brings the desert tradition of Egypt, the desert fathers, Antony the Great, Pachomius, a more eremitical tradition, which is reflected more at the beginning of the rule. Because if you read the text of the rule itself and do a study of the text, he's more and more influenced by the Egyptian tradition at the beginning, and Cashin, another, and towards the end, more and more influenced by Augustine. Augustine the Great, who set up a monastery in Hippo, where he was a pastoral, where he had a great pastoral mission because he was a monk bishop, a much more engaged type of monasticism, a monasticism in the city. Augustine, who was much more attentive to human relationships and the interplay of relationships. He wrote a very short rule, and after Benedict's rule, I'd go to Augustine's rule, because it's very short, and you can read it very quickly, and it's beautiful in the interplay of human persons. So Benedict brings these strands together, also Basil as well, and moves from the desert to the city, in a sense, in one way. It begins, de Vogüé says, with the calling of the individual in the crowd, in the prologue, and ends with a beautiful description of community life. So that's Benedict's spiritual journey, really. So within the rule itself, there is, one can detect a sort of growth in the person as he comes to write it, especially when you realise that the final chapters were probably written later. There are sort of a false ending in the rule, really, additional chapters. I'll explain it in a slightly different way in a moment. Another way of putting it is that he moves from that image at the beginning of the rule of a school of the Lord's service. What have you come to? You come to learn. You are disciples in a school. To an emphasis, that's still present, of course. We're still learning in the school of the Lord's service. But a greater emphasis on openness to each other, the dynamics of community and communion. Not just the outer aspects of community life, but the inner dynamics of communion. So he moves from school. The image really is the disciples around our Lord. There's a picture of, I think it's either Evangelico or Giotto, of Christ teaching the disciples' school to communion, the vertical dimension, to the horizontal dimension, if you like. I mean, both are present in the rule, but he moves with a greater appreciation of the human dimension. Now, at Monte Cassino, Benedict dies, and this is a manuscript showing Benedict supported in the moment of his death. And this is how Gregory the Great describes his death. As the illness grew worse every day, he asked his disciples to carry him to the oratory. There he strengthened himself for his departure, by receiving the body and blood of the Lord. While the hands of his disciples held up his weak limbs, he stood with his hands raised to heaven, breathed his last breath amidst words of prayer. And I think that is the most beautiful image. Benedict has moved in his life from Subiaco, from the solitude of the cave, which was a necessary novitiate for him, really, a necessary beginning, to Monte Cassino and being supported in community life. This is a statue that's there at Monte Cassino today on the place where Benedict is said to have died. Just think of that image. He's receiving communion, he's in communion with Christ, with his Maker, with God, but he's only able to receive communion because he's supported by the hands of his brethren. We need each other in the community, in monastic community. I think most monks, monastic life sometimes isn't easy. You might not be surprised to hear that. It has its everyday struggles. But there's another side. We need each other. We support each other. We help each other. I might not have got up at 6 o'clock this morning if the bell hadn't rung, and as St. Benedict says, the sleepy are prone to make excuses. So we are to encourage each other through prayer in the morning, or not just prayer in the morning, but in our Christian lives. I mean, some people say, I can be a Christian without the church. But we need each other to support each other. Who's going to teach us? Who's going to show us the way? It's not that we are perfect, the clergy are perfect, laity are perfect. We need each other. We support each other to show each other the way, to bring us into communion with God in a deeper way. Some people are strong and can go it alone. And Benedict says, yes, you might be able to, but you need really, he says in chapter 1, to learn in community life first before you think you can go it alone. Because it's not easy to go it alone. Because we need the knocks of community to shape us, to make us human, to make us humble. The younger Benedict, if we did a little study of the rule, and this is just a summary really because of time, there's a few more minutes left. The younger Benedict emphasizes humility, hierarchy, regularity, and asceticism. That's the younger Benedict. The older Benedict emphasizes, well, in terms of chapter 7 on humility, one might turn to love. Chapter 72, the good zeal of monks. They are to love each other, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body or behaviour. No one is to pursue what he judges better for himself, but instead what he judges better for someone else. To their fellow monks they must show the pure love of brothers, to God loving fear, to their abbot unfeigned and humble love. Let them prefer nothing whatever to Christ, and may he bring us all together to everlasting life. That's Benedict's hymn to love. Love instead of humility. But you need to go, you go to love, you have to go via the way of humility. Love, as we know, love isn't just something that's all descends. We have to go, true love involves sacrifice of the self, of going out to the other. Fraternity, instead of hierarchy, the horizontal rather than the vertical. And instead of regularity, tolerance of people's weaknesses. If people are weak and come late to office, well, help them, support them. And rather than emphasis on asceticism, community. The younger Benedict, for example, has Abbey, chapter 2 on the abbot, whereas he comes back to it with another chapter on the abbot in chapter 64, where he says, don't scour the rusty pot in case it breaks. Don't treat the monks, don't seek perfection. Well, we're looking for perfection, but if you don't go zealously at them, because they might break. Treat them gently. Treat them gently. Avoid extremes. Otherwise, by rubbing too hard to remove the rust, he may break the vessel. He is to distrust his own frailty. The abbot should be conscious of his own frailty and remember not to crush the bruised reed. And I could read on. Instead of obedience, not just to the abbot, but it's not just that, is it? We have to be obedient. That's Christ's way. It's not just to one person, but to each other. That is the way. Not a narrow vision of church or hierarchy or whatever. And humility, love. And I'd like to talk about Scholastica, but there's no time. Maybe it's Saint Scholastica. Saint Scholastica did have one or two things to teach him about love, and that's in the dialogues. Together unto everlasting life. Now, just in summary, just a couple of minutes, what Benedict became. There is another story in the dialogues that's often not told because it's in the section it's not about Benedict. The hermit Martin had chained himself to a rock inside his narrow cave. St. Benedict sent word to him that the love of Christ should keep him chained there instead of the iron chain that he was using, and the hermit heeded his advice. It's not chains that should tie us to rocks. It's not that sort of approach to monastic life. We should be tied to Christ in love and to each other in love. And a way to understand the rule is to read it against its sources, particularly the rule of the Master. It might have been mentioned in other talks. I don't know whether it's been mentioned. But that's the background. Another rule, let me just move on. For example, in the chapter on guests, Benedict uses the word humanitas. Guests must be treated with all humanity, which, again, means sometimes some commentators say that means give them a meal, something very practical. Practical love, down-to-earth love. The humanism of St. Benedict, in a sense. Whereas the rule of the Master, when he talks about guests, he says each would have his own watchman without realizing it. This room is to be locked from inside as well as from outside. The guests to be locked in, guarded at all time. Read that as a background to Benedict, where all are to be welcomed by Christ. And the most extraordinary thing he says, I think, is guests are to be worshipped. Christ is to be worshipped in the guest. It's a strong language. But that's Matthew 24, isn't it? Bow down before Christ in the other. I think that's the humanism of Benedict, really. All guests are to be welcomed. Christ is to be adored in the guest, he says. Or his treatment of the sick. The rule of the Master says, brothers who say they are ill, let them receive only liquids and eggs and warm water, which the sick can hardly get down, so that if they are pretending, hunger at least will force them to get up. That's not Benedict's attitude. Christ is to be there in the sick. They can be demanding, Benedict says. Benedict's a realist, but a loving realist. I think I would say Benedict loves humanity, is a lover of humanity, and the more I read the rule, that's the impression I get of him. Before all and above all else, care must be taken of the sick. The measure of drink. You might, I think this sums up, and I think I'll finish on this point because it's time, and we can have any questions that there are. But this sort of sums up the character of Benedict. Everyone has his own gift from God, one this and another that. That's 1 Corinthians 7:7. It is therefore with some uneasiness that we specify the amount of food and drink for others. However, with due regard for the infirmities of the sick, we believe that a half bottle of wine a day is sufficient for each. But those to whom God gives the strength to abstain must know they will earn their own reward. And he goes on to say the superior will determine local conditions if they need a bit more, or if they can't have that, they're not to grumble. There's an ideal, there's the reality. We all, the strong must have something to strive after, but the weak must not be left behind. And I think that's Benedict's humane monastic vision to the church in the centuries. And thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for a beautiful vision of what Benedict had to offer. And I think that one of the lovely things about a talk like this is that you don't just get the words, you get the meaning from the being. And I just love the soft voice, because that, to me, is Benedict. Benedict is encouraging us, but softly. So thank you very much for that. And are there any questions? Now, you won't be forced to ask a question, but if you'd like to, please do.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to. So much I would love to have said more, you know.
Can I ask you to wait till I get to you so that we can all hear the question as well as the answer?
This isn't exactly a question, it's a comment. I'm particularly struck by the comment on what you said about murmuring. Because there is a leader I've worked with that doesn't suffer with this. Sometimes they've deserved it, but often not. Any other pointers you might have for modern leaders on this one would be good.
The pointers. The trouble is we're all prone to it, though, aren't we? You know, we can all fall into the trap of murmuring. And I think, well, you know, it's love, love, love. It's not laying the law down. At the end, Benedict says this is just a little rule for beginners. And he's open enough to say, I don't have all the answers. In fact, he says, go off and read. I mean, it's like a bibliography in a sense. Go off and read Cashin, go off and read Basil, the Desert Father. He doesn't name Cashin by name. Go to these others. And the interesting thing about them, they're almost two different schools. You know, it's almost like, I don't know, go to completely opposite sort of spiritual guides or something. Be open to learn. The first word of the rule. So I think for any leader themselves, not to think they have all the answers. And the key element, which we haven't talked about, you have to talk about Lexio, I think. The rule begins with the word listen. Ascolta. I presume you know that the oldest manuscript of the Rule of St. Benedict is here in Oxford at the Bodleian Library. The oldest manuscript in the world, a long way from Monte Cassino, it's here in Oxford. The first word, obsculta, was it ausculta, this one, or obsculta? There are two traditions. Listen, the last word of the rule is, apart from the Amen, is pervenies, and you will arrive. Listen and you will arrive. And I think, you know, all of us, that is the path. Trying to listen more deeply, which means more deeply to the other. And it's not, there are different ways that we listen, you know, through the Word. Scripture is important for Benedict, but through the other, through the abbot, but not just the abbot, through other voices. We've got to let go sometimes of our own position. But Benedict, on his part, as a leader, I think he's just comes across, I mean, he can be firm, and there are some things that, oh gosh, I don't like that, but he loves, he genuinely seems to love, and I think when we are loved, it's through love that we grow. When we are loved, we grow. And I think, you know, a leader of any sort clergy, whatever. You can organise lots of programs, lots of talks, but the principal role is to love people that you are called to care for, minister to, whatever word you want to use.
This is, I can't see, but is it brother? Do I call it brother?
Fine, Brendan, yes, Brendan.
Brendan, I was struck by the comment about the murderer. Okay, murderers coming into the monastery.
Yes.
And only last night I was sitting among murderers. I go as a volunteer to Grendon, which is the only therapeutic prison in Britain. Yeah. And I go as a volunteer for the Quaker meeting for worship. And I just want to make two comments. I can't imagine a nicer and better place than a loving Benedictine monastery for these deeply, deeply hurt human beings who are so wounded and so self-loathing. It breaks your heart, to be honest. But the gift to the monastery, because you said it's not very great for the monks. Well, actually, the gift back, and it strikes me in myself so profoundly. I am at my most divine when sitting with these people, because I feel I transcend myself and become a being of deep compassion. Do you know? And I am at my most Ellen too. Something happens. God inspires me with such compassion because these folk draw it out of you. So there we have a situation where I am, through God's help, full of love, and these folk are full of love back to me. So I think both Benedictine monks and the murderers would have benefited.
That's a beautiful comment, thank you. And what is true, I mean, one's life as a priest and listening to people with, we have the sacrament of confession, and people pour out their hearts and reveal the deepest, darkest, secret sins, whatever. And that's the most humbling experience you have, really. And you realise, the saying there, but for the grace of God, go I. And some monastic writers in the tradition, different traditions, have described monasteries as hospitals. And in the sense, we are healing. Maybe we constantly need to be. We're all wounded creatures of need at different times. Sometimes we're strong, sometimes we're weak. When we're weak, we need the strength of others. At other times, we can give something from our own strength. Thank you.
Something that just strikes me as to be fully human in the way you described Benedict is to be holy.
Yes, exactly. I mean, yes, exactly. Spirituality is detached, I don't think, from that human quest, because God works. That's what the incarnation is about. God works through human beings, through humanity, and shows us. He showed us when he was on earth, Christ, how to touch heaven, really, how to live with others.
Just to follow on from Benedict has this emphasis on love.
A bit closer.
Benedict has this great emphasis on love. That's the most important thing. But what would he say to people like those prisoners who can't love themselves? What would he say to somebody caught up in this self-loathing?
Well, obviously, in one sense, he doesn't talk in the rule about such situations. But what he tells, but basically, what he tells me is something that we every day one has to keep in mind about oneself and about humanity, and that God is in us. Christ is in the other. Christ is in the stranger. To see Christ there, and to see not the sin, but as he said, not he uses the phrase, not to love, not the sin, but the sinner. So, deep down, I would hope that he would try to help the person find that the image deep within themselves, however they are marked with sin by whatever, deep within themselves is the goodness of God, the world that was made with the divine intention of God's goodness, that God is within. We sometimes mar things through our living, but there is a goodness deep within God, which is from God. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and that remains really. And some make the distinction that in the Cistercian tradition between image and likeness, that we are made in the image, but we lose the likeness through sin. But to come back and just rediscover who we are.
That's an easy question. I think we need to...
Just a quick question, a quick comment actually.
The first word of the body of the manuscript of the rule is Auskulter.
Auskulter, thank you.
There's a photograph of it on the cover of Marilyn Dunn's history.
Yes.
I'm not a Latin scholar, so I decided to look it up because my schoolboy Latin told me it should be now detailed. But Auskulter is a special word used by Latin poets. And it has a special meaning. It means to listen carefully and with an intention to believe.
Thank you. Well, yes, and that fits perfectly what Benedict goes on to say. Ascolto fili precepta magistri. Listen to the precepts of the Master. Listen, my son, to the precepts of the Master. Incline the ear of your heart, which is a beautiful image, to a Father who loves you. One has to go to the source of love. Yes. And there are two traditions. There is Auskulter, which is this one you said, and there's Obskulter, which is the more ancient tradition. So there are two lines of manuscripts that go back almost, that scholars have traced back to Monte Cassino in a certain way, which are quite interesting as well, the two scholarly traditions. But I hadn't heard it put that way before, so thank you that word from the poets.
So we're being encouraged to leave here and listen with our hearts. Thank you very much.